China is the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter by a huge margin. And if there's anything clear so far coming out of this year's Communist Party Congress, it's that coal is having a bit of a revival in the world's second largest economy. A senior energy official said China will give full play to coal as ballast in the country's energy mix.
Why are we digging stuff up out of the ground when we haven't needed to burn coal since about the 1920, 1930 time period? Here's your solar panels. I had to replace my solar panels with more, and they all end up in a landfill and they're toxic. You know, we're working in a paradigm, whether it be fossil fuels or what is being proposed as new energy, that isn't going to work.
Certainly not opposed to renewable technologies, but you know, they are dependent on weather. They're dependent on how much wind there is in an area, or they're able to harness of the sun. And they cost an awful lot to bring up to speed.
No environmentalist wants to see vast landscapes converted to biofuels, or pit mines to mine silver and cobalt and lithium, wind turbines that kill birds and mar the landscape. This isn't what we signed up for. But this is what happens when we abdicate our relational care for every place and ecosystem and being on Earth and transfer that onto yet another quantitative cost-benefit paradigm.
And you have lithium fields. The amount of pollution from these lithium mining operations for lithium-ion batteries in your Tesla, not to mention they catch fire periodically. Now, fair enough, I'm an emergency and trauma doctor. Gasoline cars catch fire more. I can tell you some horror stories, which I'm sure you don't want to hear. And then we have this whole morass of how we're living, you know, on wires that we haven't needed. And so the entire system is set up to benefit a relatively small number of global oligarchs and financial interests that we absolutely have to say enough. They've had 150 years to do this.
If we want to live among other life in the future and not in a concrete hellscape where we retreat into virtual worlds to compensate for the loss of what is alive, then we have to change our ways. And we have to start acting from our care for life.
Most of you know that there are these nanoparticulate plastics that are in the entire food chain. They cause cancer, they disrupt hormones, they damage your brain. And why? Well, if we had quote-unquote free energy systems from what we're going to describe as zero-point energy field, you would never have to have anything wasted because you could have 100% recycling because the cost of the energy would be zero. And then we have all these famines happening around the world because of the absolute social injustice of a system that is driven by greed and scarce resources. When, as Tesla pointed out, there's an infinite amount of energy to be tapped in what has now been quantified as the zero-point energy field. How do you tap it? Now, mainstream science says it can't be tapped. It's there theoretically. Not true. And you're going to find out how untrue that is.
International Panel on Climate Change, which issues annual reports about the dire state of things that we're facing. It says in their latest report that over the next decade alone, between 32 million and 130-some million people are going to be driven into poverty because of the changing climate in their countries. 3 billion people, almost half the world's population, has no way to cook their food. They have no way to heat. But what they're doing, they have to survive, is cutting down the rainforest and cutting down the scrub and shrubs in the desert. And you have what's called desertification, where you have the growth of deserts going on exponentially. You can take maps from 40 years ago and now and just see the growth of this dead zone. Why? You have 3 billion people that don't even have, even if they had access to fossil fuels, they don't have access. This is how they're living.
It's not only that 3 billion people don't have access to energy sources, it's also that their way of life is under constant assault by our own, primarily through the financial system that imposes debt through development loans and other mechanisms on most of the world, who then must, in order to meet the debt payments, must convert their environment into commodities and their time and energy into labor for the global marketplace. So if you don't include those kinds of issues, and you're only talking about let's bring more energy to the world so that we can raise them up to be like ourselves. Come on, it's not working. Being like ourselves is not working. Look at the depression, look at the suicide, look at the addiction, look at the obesity, look at the despair. This is not a fit destination to evangelize throughout the world. We need some humility here.
The dire emergency in East Africa, the drought there exacerbating the hunger crisis. As many as 20 million people could be starving by the middle of this year, half of them children.
I firmly believe there can be no peace on this planet without justice. And there can be no justice when half the population of the world is required to live in abject poverty. It's a direct result of the world's energy system. So I always liken this, we're living in this sort of the Truman Show. It's a perfect metaphor for the world we're living in now where, the people who are saying we need more oil, gas, and coal until we get something to replace it, they're right. Look what's happening all over the world. On the other hand, the people who say we can't just keep drill, baby, drill and burning oil and gas and coal because we're destroying the biosphere. And they're right. Now, when both sides are right and both sides are wrong, someone's been had. We've been had by people who want to deceive us and think that we're actually having a legitimate debate about energy and the environment. We are not. We're all Jim Carrey living in this Truman Show of a construct. So everyone's saying, well, we don't have enough fossil fuels coming out, and the density of energy from solar and wind isn't enough, so let's build more of these. Well, then you're stuck with 1 million years of toxic, life-killing waste from nuclear reactors.
Greenhouse gas emissions would only decrease, according to a recent study, by 4% if we double the amount of energy that we're getting from nuclear power by 2050. Well, that's not a very good statistic to think about.
Most people think when nuclear power plant is running that you're somehow getting energy from the atom directly. No. What you're doing is splitting the atom, as it were, creating a lot of heat that boils water, heats water. It turns a steam engine like a choo-choo train in 1849 coming out to the gold rush in California. That's all a nuclear power plant is, except you're stuck with 1 million years of waste. And this is the other problem. The distribution of the power from the point that you have the primary source, by the time you generate it, transmit it through the inefficient transmission lines, and then you're wiring in your device or your home, you've lost at least 66%. So 66% of the energy is completely wasted. So here's your energy grid. 12% is a new renewable. The rest is the old system. So if you plug in your electric car, 88% of the power is coming from gas and oil and coal.
The entire world is running on an energy paradigm of scarcity, meaning that there's never more energy than we generate, and we lose that energy as we move it around and deploy it in different ways. And so energy is expensive, and energy is difficult to get to remote areas. And that energy is important because it's inputs in growing food, and it's inputs in manufacturing, and it's inputs in the economy, and it's inputs in all of these things that make people's lives better and that solve the problems that desperately need to be solved on the planet right now. Over unity is a very simple idea. It's that you're getting more energy out of something than you're putting into it. And according to mainstream science, that's impossible.
What free energy devices suggest is that there is a limitless supply of usable energy that's always coming into reality, and that we're not living in a universe of fundamental scarcity.
So over unity is more than just a breakthrough that's going to live its life in a technical paper. It's not that. It's really the ability of humans to liberate themselves.
Yes, there is a history, a long history of over unity systems. For example, Nikola Tesla had one. Basically, his big magnifying transformer that he had on Long Island was such an over unity system. He got the entire Earth itself in resonance. everything going on that's feeding energy into the earth starts to feed energy into that wave that he created. So he gets a lot more energy in his resonant wave fed from outside, from the environment in the interior of the earth. His idea was you could then put in a tap on it anywhere else on the world and extract it free. And of course, J.P. Morgan's take on that was, that's foolish, you can't put a meter on it. So that actually doomed much of Tesla's career at that point when Morgan found out that Tesla, was going to produce the energy freely.
But I love this quote. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Now, the reason he said that is that when you use what's called a very high voltage system, you can tap in to what Professor Casimir called the zero-point energy field. Some people call it the quantum vacuum. Other people, like Professor Dirac, modestly called it the Dirac Sea. And we just tested a device last month in the Arizona desert, you'll see in a moment, that is based on that.
Nobody is really trying to get, for example, over unity, more energy out of something than you put in, because it's assumed that that is impossible. Well, that might be impossible, but only if you don't really understand the fabric of reality itself.
They just can't believe it, especially engineers, because I know how we were taught, right? There is no vacuum energy. You're just a kook when you think so, right? If they took a little more physics, they would go, well, maybe.
It's not a small thing. It's not a matter of finding proof for some technology, for some invention, and convincing everybody of it. You can't convince somebody of something that so totally contradicts their basic assumptions about the universe.
But what if there's a pool of energy available to us that we didn't even think was possible because we're operating on these 100-plus-year-old assumptions? We can't find this excess energy simply because no one's looking for it.
So-called empty space isn't really empty at all. It's actually full of energy. So instead of being like kind of a quiet, empty lake, it's more like the froth at the base of a waterfall or something. But when you go to look at the numbers, you find out that there's enough energy in the volume of a coffee cup to evaporate all the world's oceans if you could get it all of it.
And here we have a car from 1921 running without a plug. Now look at this old car. And it was pulling energy out of, they just said out of the environment. They couldn't quantify what, but they had the correct frequency, and this had a battery and some wiring, and it was running around without being plugged in. Memo to Tesla Motors, go and research this and get rid of your plug-ins. And this is one of my favorite, 1902, a farmer and engineer named Stubblefield with Tesla. He had something they called the Earth battery, or the Stubblefield battery, and it had rods going into the earth and some wiring, and it was picking up this magnetic flux field of the planet, and he was running his farm, and Tesla was there with him. 1902. So when I say 100 years, lost century, no.